The Saturday Evening Post wrote on Valentine's Day, 1837, that a scene of wicked disorder and violence took place last evening in this city. The flower riot isn't as well known as other more destructive New York City riots of the 19th century, like the Astor Place riots or the draft riots, but many parts of it, concern over the high cost of food, accusations of fake news, and inflammatory speeches, ring surprisingly familiar today. So if for no other reason than to remind us that there's no problem we face in the present that we haven't already faced in the past, the 1837 New York City flower riot deserves to be remembered. There were many factors leading up to the riot of February 13th, 1837. New York had suffered a string of devastating events. The Great Fire of 1835 had destroyed more than 700 buildings in Manhattan. Its results made worse because the ranks of the firefighters had been depleted by the cholera epidemic of 1832, which had killed nearly 4,000 New Yorkers and caused many more to flee the city. The fire had bankrupted many insurance companies, which then caused the collapse of banks. But the situation in the city was also caught up in broad national and international events, including some that would seem all too familiar in the modern world. Speculative lending had caused a bubble, especially in the West, where land speculation had run rampant following the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Lending had caused depreciation of money and national inflation. President Andrew Jackson attempted to tamp down the bubble by requiring that federal land could only be purchased using so-called hard currency backed by gold and silver. Jackson's specie circular caused a restriction in credit that then resulted in the failure of nearly half the banks in the nation. The entire world was on the verge of a recession that would be eventually called the Great Panic of 1837. Mistrust of banks and the wealthy was widespread. At the same time, the nation was suffering under a difficult period for agricultural crops. In 2013, the New Jersey Herald recalled the winter of 1835-36. Let's take a brief glimpse of some of the weather conditions extracted from the Sussex Register, one of the county's earlier newspapers. On December 4th, 1835, it was reported that a heavy snowfall had buried ungathered crops still remaining in the fields. On January 9th, 1836, 18 inches of snow fell. This was followed on January 18th by a snowstorm that left an accumulation of snow ranging from 2 to 6 feet, with no mail delivery for 4 days. A historian writing in 1881 said, "The winter of 1835 and 1836 is spoken of as the most severe ever known in this region." One effect was a shortage of winter crops and concurrent increases in prices, the Herald explains. By May 19th of the year, presumably the snow had at long last disappeared, but the long hard winter had caused provisions to increase in price. As an example, wheat flour that regularly sold for 85 cents per bushel had jumped to $1.30. Rye flour that nominally sold for 85 cents had increased to 94 cents per bushel. The problem persisted through 1836. J.T. Headley wrote in his 1882 work, Pen and Pencil Sketches of the Great Riots. From Virginia, a great wheat state, came disastrous tidings. Not only was the crop short and the price of flour high, but it was said that the latter would probably go up $15 or $20 a barrel. The cumulative effects of these factors on New York were showing. As prices rose, so had unemployment, which had risen past 30%. The website Ephemeral New York explains, as the cost of necessities such as meat and fuel began going up, a barrel of flour that had run $7 was now $12. With the recession settling in and a third of the city's 300,000 out of work, New Yorkers were outraged and feeling desperate. The website I Love the Upper West Side writes, economic discontent was creeping towards despair by the end of 1836. Manhattanites trying to make a living were met with soaring prices that made it not only difficult to make ends meet, but nearly impossible for those starting out to get anywhere. In their 1998 book, Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898, authors Edwin Burroughs and Mike Wallace note that since December, the price for flour had soared from $4.87 to $12 per barrel, and the price of pork had climbed from $13 per barrel to $24.50. Writing in the journal Radical History, Courtney Fullilove, an associate professor of history at Wesleyan University, quoted a letter from former New York Mayor Philip Hone. "Never yet have I known so dear a market as the Fulton was this morning. Had the appearance of famine. What is it to become of the laboring classes? The mechanic who has a family does not do so well now with 18 shillings per day as he did when his wages were only 12 shillings. The situation was further impacted by a relatively new factor in American cities. A 2017 article on the website All That's Interesting explains, the recent invention of the penny press, inexpensive tabloid-style newspapers, further stoked the anger of the masses.
Costing only 1 penny, unlike the 6 their competitors were charging, penny press papers such as the New York Herald appealed to the New York City working class. It's not difficult to see how the position of the penny press impacted the rising discontent. For example, the New York Herald wrote 11 days before the riot, "The great mass of people are now beginning to wake up to their common sense interests. In an account of a public meeting recently held in Portland, Maine, we see the germ of a movement en masse for which this country is now fully ripe. What is the use of taking any longer about the fanfaronade of aristocracy and democracy, Whiggery and Toryism, when flour is $14 a barrel? Interest double the legal rate, rents twice what they were 3 years ago, provisions far beyond their usual prices, and all expenses increased in proportion. These exorbitant and extravagant prices press most heavily on the poor. The rich can weather the storm, but the poor must submit to their destiny." While there could be a discussion over the relative merits of the penny press, in the case of New York in February 1837, there was a particular effect. All That's Interesting writes, "While not as well known as later riots in the city, the flour riot was exceptional in that it was inflamed entirely by a rumor." Headley writes, "As February came on, a report circulated in the city that there were only 3 or 4 weeks' supply on hand. This was repeated in the penny papers, with information added that in certain stores were hoarded vast amounts of grain. One store in particular received special interest." Headley continues, "Chief among those against whom the popular feeling was now directed was Hart & Company, large commission merchants on Washington Street between Day and Cortlandt Street. The store was packed with flour and wheat, and every day men passed it with sinister looks. Sometimes a little knot of men would stop opposite and talk of the loads of grain stored up in there while their own families were pinched for bread. They would gaze savagely on its heavy doors that seemed to defy the weak and helpless, and then walk on, muttering threats and curses. These signs of a gathering storm were, however, unheeded by the proprietors." Headley talks about a conspiracy for breaking open and plundering Mr. Hart's store, but the plot, purportedly to use false fire alarms to draw away police, never materialized. But action could not be far off. The Long Island Star wrote on February 16, 1837, "When any portion of community are in an excitable state, they are not wanting for those who will throw firebrands among them. A great part of community have lately been suffering in consequence of the high price of provisions. The highest of price was not confined to flour or any particular kind of provision, but affected the means of subsistence generally. Many ignorant people who could not understand the cause of the state of things were ready to adopt any cause that might be suggested upon, which to exercise their exasperated feelings."
So who exactly were these provocateurs that were throwing the firebrands at the excitable crowd? Well, the Star notes a peculiarly named group. It seems a branch of the active, if not numerous, faction in New York called the Loco-Focos could not suffer an opportunity to go by to operate upon the excitabilities of the discontented portion of the people.
The Loco-Focos were a splinter of the New York Democratic Party, formed largely in opposition to the politics of the Democratic Tammany Hall machine. While somewhat muddled, Encyclopedia Britannica describes the Loco-Focos as made up primarily of working men and reformers. The Loco-Focos were opposed to state banks, monopolies, paper money, tariffs, and generally any financial policies that seemed to them anti-democratic and conducive to special privilege. The website Word History describes them as a radical faction within the Democratic Party which advocated social justice and opposed vested interests, monopolies, and banks. While their politics and difference from other Jacksonian Democrats can be hard to explain, the Loco-Focos generally saw themselves as radical reformers, advocating for the working class. Their curious name was taken from a brand of friction match, based on a somewhat mistaken Latin translation meaning essentially self-lighting. The name had been derived from an 1835 meeting in which the group, originally calling themselves the Equal Rights Party, held a meeting only to have the gas lights turned off by the Tammanies. Undeterred, the group had used self-lighting matches to light candles and continue the meeting. The name, both in its connotation of starting fires and its similarity to the Spanish loco, meaning crazy, turned out to be almost comically apropos. Headley explains, at length, on the afternoon of the 10th of February, the following placard was posted up all over the city. "Bread, meat, rent, fuel. The voice of the people shall be heard and will prevail. The people will meet in the park, rain or shine, at 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon, to inquire into the cause of the present unexampled distress and devise a suitable remedy." But exactly what would such a meeting accomplish? The Star wondered. The object of the meeting, as expressed in the bills of the day, was to bring down the price of provisions. Perhaps some over-curious individual may ask what were the proposed means of regulating the principles of supply, consumption, and price. Spirit of Adam Smith assist the inquiry. All we know about the matter is that a meeting was called in the park. As this of itself could not bring down the price of provisions, the assembled people were harangued on the subject of monopolies, paper money, etc., and among other monopolies, there were inside monopolies, to which case the pressure of the times was attributed. Headley offers no question over the true purpose of the meeting. There was something ominous in the hour selected for the meeting. 4 o'clock in February meant night before it would get under full headway. It was evident that the leaders did not mean the meeting to be one of mere speech-making. They knew that under cover of darkness, men could be incited to do what they, in broad daylight, would be afraid to undertake. Still, the meeting seems to have been somewhat disjointed. Headley continues. At length, 4,000 or 5,000 shivering wretches were gathered in front of City Hall. Moses Jacques, a man who would make a good French communist today, was chosen chairman. But this motley multitude had no idea of respect for order or regular proceedings. They broke up into different groups, each pushing forward its favorite orator.
But of course the price of flour dominated the conversation, and the crowd's anger was unsurprisingly focused on Eli Hart and Company.
An eyewitness account was published in the Commercial Register the next day. There were speakers who came directly to the business of the meeting and, in the most exciting manner, denounced the landlords and the holders of flour for the prices of rents and provisions. One of these orators, in the course of his address, after working upon the passions of his audience until they were fitted for the work of spoil and outrage, is reported to have expressly directed the popular vengeance against Mr. Eli Hart, who is one of our most extensive flour dealers on commission. "Fellow citizens," he exclaimed, "Mr. Hart has now 53,000 barrels of flour in his store. Let us go and offer him $8 a barrel, and if he does not take it—" The witness then notes that the unnamed orator seems to have realized the implications and possible legal consequences of his words. Here some person touched the orator on the shoulder, and he suddenly lowered his voice and finished his sentence by saying, "We shall depart from him in peace." Of course, that last part was lost on the crowd, the witness explains. The hint was sufficient, and a large body of the meeting moved off in the direction of Mr. Hart's store. The Long Island Star takes up the story. It may readily be supposed that a number of ignorant men and foreigners only required to be told where the monopolies were to be found to take speedy means of venting their lawless passions upon them. Directed to Hart's store, the Star writes, "To this place a party consisting of 100 or 200 individuals proceeded, and after forcing an entrance into the store, commenced throwing barrels of flour into the street." The report in the Ledger writes, "The first iron door torn from its hinges, being used as a battering ram against the others. The destructives at once rushed in, and the windows and doors of the loft were broken open, and now again commenced the work of destruction." Authorities attempted to restore order, including Mayor Cornelius Van Wyck Lawrence. The eyewitness report continued in the Ledger. At this point of time, Mr. Hart himself arrived on the ground with a posse of officers from the police. The officers were assailed by a portion of the mob in Day Street. Their staves rustled from them and shivered to pieces. The Evening Post describes the police response. There was an attempt to repress the mob by the usual feeble display of police force, but without effect, and the riot went on for a considerable time, unrestrained. The New York Times wrote, "Our estimable and popular mayor, Mr. Lawrence, repaired to the store whilst the mob was engaged in their work of destruction, and attempted to speak to them. But he was assailed with a shower of barrel staves, headings, sticks, stones, and balls of flour, and compelled to retreat for his life." In addition to Hart's store, groups also attacked the store of S.H. Herrick and Company. The windows were first smashed in with a shower of brickbats, and the doors immediately afterwards broken. Some 20 or 30 barrels of flour were then rolled into the street, and the heads of 10 or a dozen knocked in. Headley lamented in front of the store and far beyond it that the flour lay half knee deep, a sad spectacle in view of the daily increasing scarcity of grain. Eventually, troops of the New York militia arrived, although the Times notes the mob had by this time, however, in a great measure dispersed. Several men were arrested and put in charge of an officer Boyer and a squad of police, but the group was attacked. In the struggle, Boyer and his assistants had their clothes torn from their backs, and several of the prisoners were rescued.
In the end, the flour riot destroyed property, but it only lasted one day and nobody was killed. Shoot, it was downright civil compared to the much more destructive riots that would be visited upon New York City in the coming decades. It's hard to say how significant it was because there's a lot of disagreement over exactly who the crowd was and what their motivations were. They didn't seem to have a clear idea of what policy they wanted to change. Eli Hart and Company came out with a note afterwards saying that the price of flour was really set by the scarcity of the commodity and that at $12 a barrel they were making a bare profit. And they added, needless to say, the destruction of an article cannot have a tendency to reduce the price. The pennies and their competitors argued back and forth, lobbing blame at each other for the riot and arguing over the treatment of the 53 that were arrested. But as the Panic of 1837 expanded, by the end of 1837, the problems seemed to be so much larger than they had been in February. The resulting depression would last well into the 1840s. But there was one significant policy change that might have impacted these riots that came in the future, because the New York Almanac notes, the riot increased the political clout of the merchant class, which had been clamoring for a long time for an increased police force. Within 24 hours of the riot, a law was passed that increased the number of New York City watchmen by 192 officers. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.